Welcome to this explainer. Today we're jumping straight into a fascinating piece of source material that tackles a massive methodological divide in Torah study. We're talking about a fundamental debate over how we actually understand ancient texts. Specifically, we're contrasting modern academic reconstructions with the internal, unbroken Jewish tradition, which we know as the Mesorah. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter? Well, because the framework you choose literally changes everything about how you read the meaning of the text. The scholars of the Mesorah argue forcefully that to truly grasp Torah laws, you have to look inward at the transmitted tradition, rather than looking outward to try and piece together clues from ancient pagan cultures.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to systematically contrast these two lenses across 6 distinct areas. We'll define the clash of frameworks, trace the chain of transmission, apply these lenses to salt and the eternal covenant, look at blood, impurity, and atonement, examine the sufficiency of Sinai, and finally synthesize the primacy of the Mesorah.
Let's dive right into Section 1, the clash of frameworks, ancient reconstructions versus internal tradition. To really get this, we first have to clearly define the two totally opposing frameworks scholars use. We're looking at a profound paradigm clash here. On one hand, you have the ancient Near Eastern, or ANE, framework. This is the modern academic approach, and it relies heavily on external, pagan comparative archaeology. It basically suggests that to understand Israelite practices, you've got to first figure out what the surrounding Canaanites, Egyptians, or Babylonians were doing. But opposing this is the Mesorah. This framework is built entirely on trusting the internal, continuous transmission of knowledge. It relies on completely self-contained Torah logic. From the traditional perspective, elevating that ANE framework over the Mesorah is a massive methodological error. It's like trying to solve a puzzle using the picture from a completely different box.
Okay, moving to Section 2, the chain of transmission, the unbroken line. What's really captivating here is how Jewish tradition establishes its own authority, totally independent of any outside archaeological support.
There is an explicit, self-contained chain of transmission. It starts at generation 1 with Moses at Mount Sinai and moves sequentially straight through to Joshua, then to the elders, the prophets, and finally to the men of the Great Assembly. The core argument is absolutely vital. The Torah was never just a bare text that somehow got lost in the sands of time, requiring modern academics to dig it up and decode it. Not at all. It came with its own oral explanations, perfectly preserved and passed down intact through these authorized channels.
And that crucial point is codified explicitly in Mishnah Avot 1:1. This text lays down the authoritative vehicle for understanding Torah laws exactly as they were delivered from Sinai. It completely rejects the idea that to be faithful to the Torah, you somehow need to filter its institutions through the worldview of the exact same nations Israel was commanded to distinguish itself from.
Section 3, Salt and the Eternal Covenant. Let's apply this to a practical case study, specifically the biblical commandment regarding salt in meal offerings. The difference in approaches here is night and day. Modern academia loves to look at Canaanite or Babylonian economics, arguing that salt was commanded simply because it was super valuable in the pagan world. They'll say it was used in trade treaties and had this huge psychological impact, but the Mesorah, it relies entirely on internal Torah logic. Within the unbroken tradition, established halakha links salt strictly to the eternal nature of the covenant and its power of preservation. It doesn't need a shred of validation from ancient commodity prices. Just look at Leviticus 2:13. It ties salt directly to the covenant of your God. The plain text firmly pushes back against the notion that the Israelites needed to study idolatrous nations to understand their own sacrifices. And to back that up, the Mishnah discusses the practical rules of meal offerings at length without ever once appealing to an external pagan cultural context. Let's keep building on this in Section 4, Blood, Impurity, and Atonement. This is where things get incredibly complex, and the divide becomes even more apparent. When academics use external lenses, they often try to explain blood rites as this metaphysical, cosmic battle between life and death forces. They'll label impurity as a sort of death contagion, borrowed from Egyptian or Mesopotamian ritual systems. But the internal, transmitted view shows that the Torah system actually functions flawlessly within its own God-given categories. Trying to interpret blood rites through a pagan backdrop of life and death forces strays way, way off the path of the transmitted tradition. Concepts like tama, ritual impurity, and kapara, atonement, are conditions and remedies defined exclusively through the procedures God gave to Israel. By defining these entirely internally, The Mesorah completely dismantles the academic reliance on those external death contagion theories. When you elevate A&E scholarship, you're implicitly diminishing the sufficiency of the Torah. You're basically implying that the sages' rulings were somehow incomplete without checking in with pagan culture first, which is simply not the case. Leviticus 17:11 is a perfect example. It operates within a totally self-contained framework. It proves the Levitical system is not some deficient practice desperately in need of pagan parallels to make sense. Atonement and purification function perfectly according to exact divine categories. I mean, nowhere does the text instruct anyone to go consult the impurity systems of an idolatrous neighboring nation to figure out how this stuff works. Section 5. Sufficiency of Sinai. This brings us right to the ratification of the Sinai Covenant itself and the undeniable sufficiency of the laws given at that mountain. The Tanakh presents this moment in Exodus as a completely unique, fully functional, and enduring event. It wasn't just preparatory, and it certainly wasn't limited in its scope. Now, some modern teachers try to describe the sprinkling of blood through the lens of ancient Near Eastern treaty rituals, almost suggesting it was limited in its ability to deal with the human condition. But the text itself never, ever frames this covenant as deficient or waiting on an outside comparative framework to finally be fulfilled. And the proof is in the tradition. The sages dedicated massive, highly detailed Mishnah tractates. We're talking about Zavachim for sacrifices, Yoma for Yom Kippur rites, Kelim for vessels, and Tohorot for purities to codify the exact mechanics of the law. This is an incredible, self-contained architectural system of oral Torah. It was developed completely independent of outside cultural supplementation. Think about it, they didn't need to dig up Ugaritic tablets to know how Yom Kippur worked. They already had the transmission directly from the temple service and the prophets. Finally, Section 6, the Primacy of Mesorah. Let's synthesize exactly why relying on this unbroken tradition is so absolutely paramount. The text of Deuteronomy offers the very explicit warning: do not add to or subtract from the commanded word. Using ancient Near Eastern sources as your primary interpretive grid runs the very real risk of doing exactly that. It introduces foreign pagan rationales that dangerously reshape the mitzvot. It forces them to conform to the mindset of surrounding nations rather than receiving them purely as they were delivered. So the source material argues that this structured three-step internal path is the only authoritative way to grasp the Torah's profound meaning. First, you study the original verses. Second, you consult the Mishnah's codification of the practice. And third, you follow the rulings as they were clarified by the sages across generations. Treating that living chain from Moses to the sages as somehow secondary to external academic reconstructions, well, that fundamentally breaks the halakhic method. Don't leave these insights in the classroom. Access the full research archives and scholarly deep dives at mishnahwalk.com. Continue the walk today.
Follow Yosef for more at mishnahwalk.substack.com.